Hello, everyone, and welcome to take two of our episode of Trek Prime this week, which I thought we did last night for about 3.5 hours. But I pressed the wrong button, and, we figured out what we did, and here we are again. But on that non-podcast, we came up with a lot of great ideas for what we were going to do, sort of a run-through. And the subject is going to be the same as the one we didn't do. And that is racism, prejudice, bigotry within the Star Trek universe. Now, as I established in our first try, the idea of Star Trek itself was formed based on the idea that humanity had overcome issues like bigotry and warring amongst themselves and almost tribalist behavior, and we're ready to go out into the stars and explore the galaxy. And they would have a multicultural crew from Earth and perhaps some aliens a little later on, which they did. But Star Trek never shied away of dealing with prejudice and bigotry and racism. And the writer Daisy Fontana put it very well. They could talk about racism metaphorically happening in real life and prejudice by saying, hey, it's happening on another planet, guys. That's how she put it. And we're basically going to be talking about some of that today. Now, one thing we talked about last night pretty well, and I wanted to extend on it in our actual podcast, is Enterprise. In Season 3, there was a race of different species called the Xindi who attacked Earth because of Earth attacking them in some future we don't see, right? And they went right up the equator, the Florida coast, and this huge swath of area. So Enterprise and XO1 spend Season 3 looking for this Xindi weapon. And when they come back to Earth in Season 4, in an episode called Home, humans have become rather distrusting and bigoted toward extraterrestrial life, haven't they?
Yes. Because when Phlox and some of the crew went down and they were on Earth and they were at a bar or a restaurant or something like that, they were just sitting there and a bunch of people got mad when they saw them because, they're like, why are we telling everybody in the galaxy where we are? You're just bringing all these aliens here and, how can we trust them? They're all trying to destroy us and everything. And it led to a great big fight where Phlox had to do this thing with his face where he
fish, yeah. And, it's funny, thinking of, when the internet age was really going on, as a little aside, Enterprise was on the air during the ascendancy of the internet. And one of the things that happened when they first started having the GIF files, the little moving pictures, was the Phlox face. That was one of the first GIFs I ever saw. And I didn't see that episode until I got the DVDs. I didn't see it on TV. So I didn't understand this giant puffish face. Apparently he's Denoblian, so that was a Denoblian way of kind of like a person gasping or something. It was a way of kind of defending passively. Yeah. And of course, being the Phlox is an alien, and he's exhibiting very non-human behavior in that scene, that probably didn't help the cause, now that I think about it. But anyway,
it just scared everybody, and that was enough to stop the fighting, so that's
just took him out off guard. But later in that season, that whole incident developed into this organization on Earth called Terra Prime. There was this issue where they used T'Pol and Trip's DNA to create this essentially early version of Spock, this Vulcan human hybrid baby, as an example of what could happen. I think Baby had some problems. As an example of what would happen if different species interbred. And, so you started to see the development of a new kind of bigotry on Earth. And, the Vulcans had always said we weren't ready for interstellar travel. And that incident kind of may have almost proved them right, because humanity were taking the bigotry they had once had toward each other and applying it to unknown life forms in the rest of the galaxy at that particular time. And Enterprise kind of just ended after that. They did that. These were the voyages, which had nothing to do with Terra Prime. Yeah. And they never really followed up with that,
Well, during the first couple of seasons, I think, of Enterprise, there was sort of an animosity between humans and Vulcans that kept getting played out through the series. But
kind of a weird thing
But
when you look back at it, but it was there.
Yeah, it wasn't as bad as it ended up being in season 4, where they were just against all the aliens. You know, they didn't want any aliens on Earth and stuff like that. So yeah, it really got worse. But you know, like you said, it created that whole Terra Prime thing, and you know, and they could have went further with it, I guess, because they make it seem like, oh well, once they got rid of the guy there that started that movement there, can't remember his name now, but he was yeah. So the villain there, when they got rid of him, I mean, it was like, oh, everything's over, but it really wasn't. I mean, because you know, there was still people on Earth and on that colony on Mars that were just, you know, so it could have been an ongoing problem with Starfleet, you know, in years that came later, you know, that there was going to be a problem, you know, keeping the planets unified with the Federation that they were trying to create, you know.
I wonder if Terra Prime was what led to the beginnings of the Federation, the idea that, you know, these xenophobic attitudes, and I mean, it really was pure xenophobia, when you think about it.
Yeah.
These were people who were dealing with, you know, in our real life, we often call people from other country aliens because they may seem foreign to us, alien cultures.
Yeah.
But the point is that with Star Trek, you know, I wonder if the Starfleet thought, you know, if we unify these cultures more and try to find ways of emphasizing commonalities so the differences between them will be easier to reach for, and there won't be misunderstandings like this as common in the future. Perhaps Terra Prime will gradually wind down as time goes on. Perhaps the Federation was a reaction to those kind of things. Like the last gasps of the old pre-World War III Earth attitudes about xenophobia. It could have been that. You know.
Yeah.
But that's Enterprise. So we go to TOS. Now, obviously, that was created with the attitude there'd be no conflict among the characters. That's what Gene Roddenberry kind of wanted, not among the human characters, to have conflict.
Yeah.
So they dealt with racism in a backdoor way, and a very famous way. And Let This Be Your Last Battlefield in was that second or third season? I should know this.
Third season, yeah. I think it was third season.
Frank Gorshin, I forget the name of the guy. Frank Gorshin played Beale, who was chasing after this man named Lokai. And they were from a planet called Chiron, which was, I guess, in the southernmost part of the galaxy. I guess, I don't know if the Federation had been there or not, but they knew about it. And they'd never seen people, I guess they hadn't, because they had never seen people like Beale and Lokai. They looked kind of like a yin and yang, you know. They had one side completely white, the other side completely black. And they hated each other. One group was enslaved, and there was this issue about you know, chattel, about the chattel member of this race. And the Enterprise crew seemed to have trouble understanding how this race that looked superficially alike to them could be bigoted. And the problem is that they weren't black or white on the same side.
Yeah.
And that was the source of racism. And it seemed pretty ridiculous. And they went back to their planet, and of course, you know, it was totally destroyed by these wars, and they just went back and continued fighting each other on this dead planet, as if the hate was all they had. So they dealt with it in an offhanded, but in a pretty heady way.
Yeah.
You know, can you think of, now that I think about it, any other moments in TOS where they dealt with issues of prejudice and bigotry happening on another planet level like that, or as strong?
Well, like you mentioned, you know, the first take of this, we were talking about Balance of Terror, where we had
Styles.
Styles was having issues with the Romulans and stuff like that, and Kirk kind of had to slap him down a little bit. And then when they find out what the Romulans look like, then he started to direct his bigotry towards Spock, because Spock looked like the Romulan, and so now we can't trust Spock because he looks like them, and you know, it didn't matter to him, you know, all the years that he served with them or whatever, and you know, so it was like, you know, there's still a little bit of that. It's sort of like it was mirroring the old Civil War Confederacy thing, where a generation,
like the lost cause, yeah,
you know, it's like, you know, it just gets passed down from generation to generation, this hatred towards somebody, you know, and even though they weren't personally affected by it, you know, they were just raised to hate them, you know.
Right. And I noticed, you mentioned that balance of terror. Well, I mentioned it, and then you mentioned it back to me.
Yeah.
The fact is that one of the things in Star Trek about bigotry from humans is that they usually relate it to some sort of military conflict. Because in a military conflict, there often becomes a point where, due to a situation that occurs in a battle, during war, you're supposed to attack your enemy. But if there's a treaty signed, then you learn to understand them. But there are some people who actually come to really hate their enemy for a personal reason. And, I think with Styles, I think if that hadn't, one of his relatives died in the Romulan War, which should have taken place during Enterprise, I should add, but they cut it off before that could happen. And, I think he was bringing, like you said, the Civil War veteran, lost cause attitude that, was an issue that kind of cropped up with him. Which brings me to Star Trek The Next Generation, who dealt with bigotry in a somewhat similar way. There was an episode called The Wounded, where we met the Cardassians. We didn't know their relationship with the Bajorans, which we'll get to a little bit later at that time. Although Mark Alemo was in it as another Gull. I wasn't Ducat, it was Musset. Was that the name of it? Gull Musset? Yeah. When the Cardassians wore those brown outfits. But anyway, there was this Federation captain, Captain Maxwell, who was on this Nebula-class starship, the Phoenix, that was, going rogue and was trying to destroy these supposed weapons depots along the Cardassian border, since there was a treaty. And we saw in that episode, when they brought Cardassians on board the Enterprise to investigate the problem and what was happening with the Phoenix, Chief O'Brien exhibited some very bigoted attitudes toward the Cardassians, didn't he?
Yeah.
And that was kind of based on war, too, wasn't it? Because of what happened on that planet, Setlik 3, where he lost people to Cardassians.
Yeah, he had a bad experience on one mission there during that war. Yeah.
And we were talking about racial epithets used within the Star Trek universe. And I remember he referred to them as Cardies. Kind of, I wouldn't say dehumanizing them, because that's a whole different story. But, and I remember he also had said in that episode, I was reminded today of this, where he had said to Keiko, something to the effect that, well, I shouldn't trust them just because they're Cardassians. And Keiko said, Miles, that's a very ugly thing you just said. So, she recognized what it was and didn't like it because bigotry is kind of profane in that time. If you look at it among humans, they kind of consider it profane. It happens, but they don't normalize it at all.
Yeah,
it's considered almost profane. So, with that situation, and I suppose I should mention Picard, because again, now he was bigoted toward, I wouldn't call it a race, but he was bigoted toward another group, I guess you could call it, an alien group, collective, if hint, the Borg. And that's because the Borg had, would you say assimilated him, or just kind of somewhat transformed him mildly? I was never quite certain. Have a little cubist thing there.
Like pseudo, kind of, I don't know. I mean,
he was individual still. He said, I am
able to, it was sort of like a semi, kind of thing.
Yeah, and you could see those scenes where they showed the Borg
budget
putting devices on him, and you saw tears coming down his eyes, like he was feeling.
Like put him in a different outfit or something.
So then, when he came out of that, he felt like he had been removed from himself, and he felt the Borg had basically destroyed his life. And later on, in an episode called I, Borg, when they met an injured Borg who had been disconnected from the collective, and they eventually named him Hugh, he wanted to send some sort of code into him that would destroy the whole Borg collective. But in the end, after realizing what happened to Borg drones when they became individual, he decided to, put something in his head that would essentially break all the other Borg that this Hugh came in contact with out of the collective, which had repercussions later due to lore, but that's another story. But the point is, Picard overcame some of his bigotry against the Borg, sort of. Because when First Contact came out, all of a sudden it was kind of there still. And you mentioned there was a reason why that happened, something about an earlier
Well,
story.
the story, they picked up elements of the story that they were going to do in a TV series, but I guess they didn't
Yeah.
follow up on it. And so, First Contact was more or less written like not too long after uh,
Best of
Best of
both
Both.
worlds. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Well,
and
it's supposed to be a
so
season 3 show more. Season 4, I should
yeah,
say.
it was supposed to be like the Borg's second attempt to go after Earth, but it would have been done on TV instead of in the movie theater. And but what happened, I guess, is they decided to do these other Borg episodes, like we said, iBorg and more things like that, and to try to maybe they just felt like they weren't going to be able to do it, later on in the story to see him deal with this, aftermath of the feelings of what happened to him.
Maybe you could look at it also this way with Picard. Maybe the reason why he warmed up to Hugh is because Hugh was becoming an individual. And he began to accept him as an individual. But understanding the Borg had a queen, and the queen was guiding them. Perhaps in First Contact, the anger that he had toward the Borg was focused on the queen. Not the drones, but the Borg queen. That could also work, I guess.
But, the other added part of that was that they gave Picard this sort of insight, into when they were going into battle against the Borg.
Yeah, like his implants had been taken.
Things, and he didn't have that before,
Yeah, that was kind of odd, I guess, but
it was like something they added into it that just didn't add up, because it's like, well, look, this isn't the second time he's encountered them. We've seen him encounter the Borg before when he was, in season 6, I think, where they were going after Lore, and Lore had
Descent. Yeah, we were just mentioning that, and
again
was a liberated Borg, but again, we also didn't see any Picard insight into that, so
yeah, there was no explanation given.
I don't know. Because Crusher said she removed all of his implants. She didn't say just some, all. So, because he wasn't fully assimilated. So, I think with, later on with 7 of 9 and Voyager, it was a little different. But not to get too off track here. I'm just saying that this could be all catalyst to why he felt that way about the Borg. But I want to go back a little bit, backtrack to issues that happened in the movies about Prejudice. And you brought this up last night. Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. Pretty much dealt with it headlong, now that I think about it, didn't it? I mean, it dived right into it.
Yeah, you just, we pick up with Kirk after, Star Trek 5, and, we find he's embittered, and he's, I have to assume that between 5 and 6, there were a lot of other things that happened, and, Kirk, I guess, was really... It just fed his hatred towards Klingons after what happened to his son. That things just were falling apart between the Federation and the Klingon Empire.
I believe when I read the novelization and heard the audio tape, there was this. I guess it was an unseen element. Of course, one Klingon had killed his son David in Star Trek 3. One of Crew's people had killed him.
Yeah.
And what happened is that, in the novelization, maybe you remember it, his ex-girlfriend, David's mother, Carol Marcus, was injured in a Klingon attack on a research base at a planet called Themis. And she was dying or dead, I'm not sure. She was not in good condition. And Kirk was called away to this conference about praxis right in the middle of looking after Carol Marcus. And there was this feeling that, well, our son was killed, and now, she's going to possibly die. And he might be coming after the whole group of us, these Klingons. They don't like us, and they're all going to come after us. Maybe that's what motivated his bigotry there.
So there was more going on than just him dealing with his son, I guess, as far as the story was saying.
Well, that's what it said about that attack on that Themis and Carol Marcus. Yeah. That wasn't in the movie. That was in the script, and it was just part of the book. But there were other things. Like I said, I don't know what happened after Star Trek 5. Like you said, there could have been a broader confrontation. Kirk might have been involved in that attack on Themis, repelling that ship. So attack that base. So who knows? I mean, there might have been Spock might have been at the diplomatic table while Kirk was sitting there saying, "Yeah, they're negotiating peace with the Federation, but they're out there attacking research bases for no reason too." So, the movie dealt with that, and I just thought of a line in that where Chekhov at this very awkward dinner they had on the ship, which led to more his conversation. He said that we feel that everybody has in the galaxy has the rights to inalienable human rights or whatever. And the Chancellor Gorkin, who was overseeing these negotiations, his daughter, I believe it's pronounced Azadbor, she said, "Oh, inalienable human rights. If you could only hear yourself, your very name is racist. The Federation is a Homo sapiens only club." In other words, she indicated that Klingons on a political level actually felt like they were going to be excluded from the Federation because one of his people, Brigadier Kereler, I think was his name, he had said that Klingon didn't want to have to conform to Federation politics, which we talked about in the last one. This imperial race that subjugates others, and for generations, they did not maybe want to conform to Federation ways of doing things. So it dealt with the Klingons not wanting to be like the Federation, but the Federation wanting to insist that Klingons were savage beasts and couldn't be trusted. So there was bigotry, and there were Klingons accusing the Federation of being bigoted.
Yeah.
And there was conspiracies, and it actually dealt very fundamentally with bigotry. And Nichelle Nichols often talked about how it was right around the time where, perestroika and glasnost were coming to a conclusion, where the Soviet Union was coming down, and where, there was that openness, that post-Gorbachev openness and change of government. And that was around the time that movie was made, right? The Soviet Union came down.
Yeah, it was right around that period. A lot of people say that the story kind of came out too late because it was dealing with issues that were ending.
Right. So I think for us, I don't know how you felt, but maybe you felt more because you had actually been in the military. I obviously wasn't, but when you look at it from our generation, you have to wonder if there were people during that time who felt like Kirk about Russian people. So, Kirk was from another generation. Maybe the younger people in Starfleet at that time wanted to kind of bridge a gap between...
It's harder if you're in the military to suddenly look at your enemy as your friend.
Exactly. Because,
you've been trained all your life to hate these people, to work against them. And now all of a sudden you have to embrace them, and that's at the end of it. That was what he was saying, that it's
that was Kirk's issue.
Yeah, and he didn't want to do it, and it's just it would be easy for civilians to kind of overcome.
Exactly, because they didn't fight the war and they weren't involved in the battles.
But the yellow war horses, oh my God! It mirrors today, because even today, the United States today still doesn't trust Russia or, the people there or the military there.
Yeah.
And, they're constantly trying to egg each other on to start this thing all over again. So it's,
Well, it's like Kirk said about Klingons. Didn't he tell Spock at one point, "I think I got used to hating Klingons."
Yeah.
And I think you can get used to it. Hatred can become a crutch. And, not so much that it's not good, but that you just become endowed to it and used to it, and Star Trek 6 reflected that very, very literally. I don't know why I didn't think of it last night, but
the funny part of Star Trek 6 was at the beginning when they were saying, well, what are we supposed to do, mothball the Starfleet? And the Admiral, he says, oh, our scientific programs will still be there. And I was thinking, well, what about the Romulans? You guys forgot about the Romulans.
It's funny you mentioned that, because there was a Romulan ambassador who was talking with Sarek and the Starfleet president, and he was involved in the conspiracy, I guess, somehow. But he was almost peripheral. Now, it's funny, at that time, were the Romulans still kind of semi-Klingon allies?
That I don't know.
I think Khitomer, the attack on Khitomer, which was mentioned and actually shown in Star Trek 6, Camp Khitomer, I think that ended the Romulan-Klingon relationship, whatever it was, because I don't think they were hating on each other then in the 23rd century.
I don't know, but all I know was that when they were saying that they didn't have any more enemies to fight, so we're going to do mothball the Starfleet. I was thinking, well, you guys are forgetting about the Romulans. You guys are still in a Cold War with the Romulans.
I don't know. They probably had other adversaries too. There were other adversaries they mentioned that might have been around then. Cisco mentioned one, the Zenkethi. Had been around.
You got the Tholians. You don't know the Tholians,
right?
They run into the Cardassians years later.
So but I think that was more of a snide thing. Like, oh well, without the Klingons, what's the point? I think they were just being snide. like feeling like, well, we have to hold on. I know the whole movie is about holding on to bigotry just to sustain something.
Yeah.
We can't just find new challenges.
I mean, when just in that statement, though, I mean, you figure they built a whole military just because of the enemy that they had to deal with.
And Starfleet,
all the resources, all their wealth, all their everything has gone into their fueling of their Starfleet just to protect them from the Klingons.
Yeah, and Starfleet always said they didn't believe in battleships and all that. So evidently they built these battleships, I guess. I don't know. Or maybe they really armed their cruisers, really. The Reliant was a small cruiser, the Miranda class. But, you got to wonder if maybe because the Miranda, isn't that area over the back of the saucer, wasn't that interchangeable?
Were you talking about the torpedo?
Well, where it wasn't the Reliant. Wasn't that interchangeable? Like the
well, yeah, it was like an optional thing. They could either put it on there or not.
Right, because the Saratoga, I believe, didn't have it. So in Emissary in Deep Space Nine. So maybe that was like the Miranda could be a battleship. So perhaps there were Miranda class ships that were built with these things for Klingons. Maybe they armed the Connie refits, and who knows? Maybe they took the Excelsior when they revised it. Because we know the Excelsior in Star Trek 6 was not like the one in Star Trek 3. They totally redesigned a lot of the inside. So who knows? Maybe they just stuck a lot of armaments onto that, and they built these really, like the Akira class later or whatever. They built these more battle-oriented ships at that time.
Yeah.
And maybe they figured that, well, we can only build exploration ships now because, we won't need these big battleships going out there and firing torpedoes at Klingons. Maybe that was just the sarcastic remark they were kind of going with,
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the main subject. They're good diversions, though. They are, because, people build up battle fleets through the bigotry. Some people I've actually heard in real life say they think that certain degrees of bigotry are positive because it makes military might bigger.
Yeah.
But, like I said, again, they're just justifying. We got to find something to justify why we're bigoted. We spent all this resources and whatever. And even in Starfleet, we've put all these resources into military, and and that's why the Klingons wanted to seek peace, because Praxis being destroyed, they couldn't put money into their military as much.
Yeah.
So I don't know the Klingon economy. They use another sort of currency, but they had a military budget, and whatever it was, they couldn't invest in these big battleships as much. So
yeah.
Which may explain why you see a lot of bird of prey in the future from the Klingons. Now that I think about it, you didn't see a lot of big battleships till the middle of the Next Generation, but except the old ones that were being reused. But anyway, a couple other Star Trek movies addressed bigotry in a very strange way. Nemesis, I got ahead of myself. Insurrection dealt with it, that you had this race of people on this planet who were kind of agrarians, and this spacefaring race who were plotting to kind of relocate them with the Federation. And you thought they're just being bullies. But later on, you find out that they're actually the same race, and they're looking for this key to immortality that this other part of the race that were left there, and there's a blood feud. And there's definitely prejudice there because they're looking for resources from this other planet. So they didn't really address the race issue there, but they did address colonialism when you say the idea they're trying to relocate these people.
Yeah.
Oh, I got to backtrack to the series again. The Next Generation, Native American characters. They had an episode that openly addressed in the Next Generation discrimination against Indian/Native American/First Nation people.
Yeah.
And they didn't pretend it was anything but what it was. They had this colony of North American Indians near the Cardassian border when they were sort of beginning the events that started the Maquis, and Picard didn't want to relocate them. And there was a whole episode about it.
Yeah.
It was sort of a Wesley episode, but they dealt with it. It wasn't an alien race who looked like Native Americans. It was Native Americans who settled on another planet. So, and Picard, and basically it was a civil war fought by a foreign government, and Picard didn't want to get involved in that case. He did not, and especially when he found out that one of his relatives was engaged in an attack on the Native American culture in the past. It became more about wiping away a stain of blood. So they actually dealt with real life Earth bigotry in that way in that episode, pretty flat out. Now we get to the big stuff. I'm going to go to Nemesis a little bit later, but I'm trying to go chronological as much as I can here with this. Deep Space Nine, okay? In terms of the character interactions, would you say that possibly was a series that addressed a high level of bigotry as kind of the main driving character arc of the show?
Yeah, I mean, it was, there was a lot in there about that through the whole series. I mean, it was just a constant, mistrust between the Cardassians and the Bajorans, and how certain Bajorans felt and looked at the Cardassians after 50 years of occupation. It was, and then you got this thing about Gul Dukat, about how he treated the Bajorans when he was in control of the station.
Yeah, he ended up being. I don't. Would you call him a Hitler or more of a Joseph Goebbels type? I mean, if we were comparing Cardassians to space Nazis.
It's hard to say because, the thing about Dukat was they don't really, you hear his side of the story, and then you hear the other side of the story, and they leave it up to you to figure out, which is the truth, and it's like, people often will color their perceptions of what's true and what isn't true. You know what I'm saying? So there's three sides to every story. His, hers, and the truth. You know what I'm saying?
Right. I think
a lot of time, Gul Dukat might have been depicted as being more villainous than he really was at the time. I mean, he might have been harsh in certain things, but it's hard to say if he was like a Hitler or anything like that.
There was an episode where he had a nervous breakdown, I guess, and he was trapped with Sisko on this planet when their ship crashed, and he was actually seeing his enemies or whatever that weren't there, and he was talking to Sisko about how he tried to be lenient, but the Cardassians kept repaying him with attacks. And it came off basically like he's trying to justify what he did. And Sisko flat out said, what's the point of talking about the truth? You reshape the truth into whatever you want. So I guess I always saw Dukat, I looked at his actions, and over again, he did whatever he had to do, not to protect his daughter, Zial, who he abandoned at first.
Yeah.
Not to protect his people, but to protect his own interests. So I would guess that Dukat was a pretty straight-up villain, but as Picard said about another villain that had nothing to do with bigotry, the villain that twirls their mustache are easy to spot, but the ones who clothe themselves in good deeds are better camouflaged. And Dukat was always one of these villains who would say, I'm doing something good for my people. Whether it means joining the Dominion, whether it meant even working against the Klingons with Major Kira, which he did when they wanted to invade Cardassia. So I think that Dukat was a tricky villain, Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, like I said, when I watched it, they made him more villainous as the show went on, especially when it related to how he was interacting with Sisko and this whole Bajoran, godlike kind of thing that I really didn't like either about.
Yeah, that just was too many irons in the fire. Really.
Yeah, I mean, but like I said, you still, you had Major Kira, that was constantly lamenting over Dukat, and you have to look back in history where people that have been oppressed sometimes will kind of overstate things just to make it like. They'll add to the story as time goes on. The truth gets distorted, and the more victimized they feel, the bigger the story is going to be, and so they feel like you kind of get that impression that it's just after 50 years of an occupation. I mean, how much truth really got buried?
Well,
because the Bajorans did some pretty heinous things against the Cardassians that only escalated matters even worse.
Well, I think basically when you have an occupation like that, it was...
I mean, everybody's hands are going to get dirty.
It was a Nazi-like relationship, except there was a little difference. In the Nazi situation, people who were put in concentration camps or whatever were in no position to fight back at all. There was no real militia, I don't think. There were Marquis, more in France than anything. But, the Bajorans had a fleet of freedom fighters that fought against the Cardassians. But I think Ducat, in his mind, his bigotry was an us and them mentality. Where, like you said, the reality was somewhere in the middle, where I don't think the Bajorans just wanted to give it to Cardassians just because it was something to do. I think they felt threatened, and they gave up a caste system that kept their society at peace for many years to become soldiers and fight. But I think the intention was initially to fight for their freedom, but I think what happened after a while is that the Cardassians painted them as a terrorist group. So, as with many times in history again, the Bajorans actually started to mold themselves to become what the Cardassians painted them as being.
I mean, it's like, it was mirroring, like, how the United States goes into other countries to stop, to civilize the countries, like we go into Iraq and all that. The people over there will look at us as destiny because of we're going over there and we're shooting up the place and everything and chasing down suspects. But we look at ourselves, no, we're the good guys because we're trying to help people, So they're, like I said, the truth will get lost in a situation like that.
I think with Ducat, he also said that, and there was an episode I mentioned last night, it was basically a mini Schindler's List, a pocket Schindler's List. There was just a bottle episode. Kira and this character, I think his name was Maritza, and he was a file clerk at this labor camp that they had poisoned, and they contracted some disease or something, and he was disguising himself as the Gul Darheel, who was in charge of the labor camp, so he could take credit for what happened. And so you see behavior that's sort of sadistic, and basically Kira wants to see him sentenced to death. So you see it getting pretty equal here. She wants to see him die for his crime. He wants to die for his crime. When she finds out who he is, she realizes that, maybe he could, and I'm going to quote a contemporary thing here, maybe he'll kind of, by doing this, jettison the very fine people on both sides kind of attitude that we have right now with the Cardassians and the Bajorans, but he gets killed by an angry Bajoran, and because he's Cardassian, and Kira has to say, no, that's not the reason enough to kill him. So she learned a little bit, I think, from that. And like I said, in the end, she actually worked with a former adjutant for Ducat, Damar, to help bring down the Dominion Cardassian alliance when it was really failing. So you could see that in the end, there had to be a divide and conquer thing, because it was a very complex relationship. And unlike there was a Nazi relationship, definitely, a Holocaust type of situation, but the Bajorans actually fought back, like you said, a little bit more. So it got messy. I think we got messy around the middle, but I don't see the Bajorans as being out and out bigoted toward Cardassians just because they were inferior or whatever. It was more like, I don't like them because they were cruel.
Yeah.
Kira said, we never understood why you had to be so cruel. We were peaceful people before you came. So I think it was more trauma. I think the bigotry the Bajorans had was based in trauma. And the Cardassians outright said it. That Maritza guy, he said, we needed your resources. Like you said, people going into foreign countries now, trying to civilize people when they just want to take a resource they need. That was how the relationship ended up being. So Deep Space Nine dealt with the complexity of it a lot, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Because it's complex to us talking about it now, but they really went that way with it and made it very complex. Now,
I mean, that was really the only way. I mean, because if you got a station that just sits around the planet, the same planet week after week after week, you can't help but write stories like that start to get complex, because how are you going to find something to write about? Where you're not going out and meeting new races every week.
What happened is, when they met a new race, Deep Space Nine basically evolved into a World War II melodrama, basically.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that, when the Dominion came in, they had Vic Fontaine, the singer.
Yeah.
They had like entertaining troops, and it basically became like a,
Even the battles there, what was it though, that one where they were stuck on that planet, they were trying to protect that...
Siege of AR something, where Nog lost his leg.
I mean, that was so mirrored of a World War II, situation,
Yeah, that was like an Iwo Jima almost. It was like one of these battles with the Axis powers. It had that effect.
It was like, it's like D-Day there on that planet. I mean, it was like, my God, I mean, you got the Jemadar rushing up the beachfront,
right? Yeah. As a little aside, and there were actually episodes where they were actually in these deserts and fighting these World War II like battles too. But there was one scene where they were going to attack the Dominion, all these ships coming toward them, and, the crew start going into this shared verse poetry about going into war. I don't know if you remember that scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I thought, oh, Deep Space Nine, come on. I mean, it get a little corny at times, but I'm just saying, because it's like, I don't think in the future it's going to be like a World War II movie starring Jimmy Cagney or Gary Cooper. And then they kind of gave it that feel of a World War II thing where you're going to recite some poetry before you blow somebody up,
Yeah.
It's very, maybe we're trying to mimic that because it did seem that way, but it really became less about prejudice and more about the Federation are good, the Dominion are bad, and whatever. It just became more simplistic. But when we get to Voyager, you mentioned something interesting. I had a hard time finding how prejudice became an issue there. But you mentioned an issue that occurred in Deep Space Nine with those border issues we talk about. The Maquis, a group of former Federation colonists and Starfleet officers who defected from their colonies, defected from their ranks, and essentially became something of a terrorist organization against the Federation turning within it itself.
Yeah.
And I did actually find out the Maquis were created for the express point of making Voyager happen. That is true. So there was this Maquis ship. They were trapped in another side of the galaxy, and Janeway had to work with them, and she decided this all got to be a Starfleet crew. But you mentioned some other things about that last night with Tuvok, who was a Maquis double agent, and his attitudes toward the Maquis at first.
Yeah, I mean, you find out during the series that he created some kind of a program on the holodeck, to if there was a possible Maquis uprising on Voyager, how he'd have to deal with it. So, I mean, there was a certain level of mistrust that he had for the Maquis, just because his job as security officer requires that he has to think of what's the worst possible thing that could happen, and I got to be ready for it.
Worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the name of the episode, actually?
What's that? Wasn't
that actually the name of the episode that had that worst case scenario?
I can't remember what the name of it was, but I just know that, he had created this program, and then it became, somebody had found it because he didn't delete it or something like that, and people were playing with it, you remember?
Like a holonovel, yeah.
Yeah. And they said, who wrote this thing, and then they find out it was Tuvok that wrote it.
And Tuvok wrote it, presumably during Voyager's first season, when the Maquis were presumed a potential threat, and then rather than logically just deleting the whole program when things became less urgent, he kind of left it festering in there, which I found kind of strange, but he said, maybe they'll become a threat, so I'll just leave it in there and get back to it when I need it. But, what happened is there was, I think, didn't Seska go in before she left and reprogrammed it to kind of screw up the ship or something?
Yeah, I guess, that's how it went. Yeah, she had found it herself and did something to it.
Not to digress. The point is that, Tuvok, he actually, but I don't know, was that bigotry on Tuvok's part or prejudice, or was it more logic-based tactician? That's what I was wondering if you thought that was.
It's hard to say because, when we have the job that he's got and you have to look at situations in dire outcomes or something like that, and you have a responsibility to protect a bunch of people, and some of those people you can't trust. You're walking a fine line there between falling into the racist thing or the bigotry thing, and or not. You know what I'm saying? I mean, logic. I think logic will carry you a little way, but eventually, if you keep doing this long enough, it'd be like what happened with Valeris in Star Trek VI. You start to create your own demons, about certain people. And
as an aside, that was supposed to be Saavik, wasn't it, in Star Trek VI?
Yeah, originally, but I guess Gene Roddenberry didn't want them to use a character that everybody liked and have her become a turncoat at the end. But
so they created a new character who had a grudge.
It would have been more impactful if they'd have kept her in there. I think it would have improved the movie considerably if they'd had her do that. That would have justified how Spock reacted. Remember, you kind of slapped that face.
Yeah, he got all emotional on Valeris, but we just assumed he had a long relationship with her, mentoring her, and I don't know.
Yeah, but we knew as the audience, we knew she was the one that was going to turn, right? Because she was the the new character, right? So it's like everybody knew she was the traitor, you know.
I guess you have to speak for yourself on that, because I was about 11 watching that, and my deductive reasonings were still forming a bit. So honestly, for the first time I kind of figured that she was one at fault was when she was just outside the captain's door when he was making that log about not trusting Klingons.
Yeah.
Right, and then of course hearing that recorded at the trial.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, I get it now. It's her, because he was right there. So at first I wasn't thinking of it that way.
It took the impact right. It sucked it right out of the whole story.
Right, because there were so many easy ways to figure it out as you went into the story.
Yeah, I mean, the only other impact was the admiral that we saw in Star Trek 4.
Brock Peters, Cartwright.
Yeah, Cartwright. Yeah, Admiral Cartwright. We saw, when he was involved with it. Yeah, it was sort of a shocker there, but it would have been even bigger if we'd have found out one of our favorites had done that.
Yeah,
but like I said, Roddenberry didn't like the idea of these people having conflicts or something like that, which was an opportunity lost, I think. Following that, could have really made an impact in the story.
Or so what happened was that we backtracked a little bit to Star Trek 6, but let's go forward to the last prime timeline movie they did, Nemesis.
Nemesis.
The thing about that was that they kind of dealt with this Picard clone. I think Shinzon was his name, trying to take over the Remans, and because the Romulans are an empire, they keep missing opportunities in Star Trek to showcase racism and prejudice among the Romulans. Yeah. I assume there's some prejudice against Vulcans among Romulans. They're not really, even though they come from Vulcans or related to them. There was even a Star Trek novel where they implied that Romulans outright separated from the Vulcan culture. I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't know. There was a reunification that may go well with that theory if they were once. Maybe Vulcans actually had two humanoid races on that planet.
Yeah.
And the Vulcans, when one of the novels I read, it was called The Lost Years, was that during the old medieval Vulcan times, they called it the Old Date, the Vulcans had high masters who used their mental powers like wizards to, maintain plutocracies or whatever. But what happened is that one of them changed their name to honor Serac, who was taking the Vulcans toward logic. So a lot of Vulcans who wanted to keep the High Master mentality left the planet Vulcan on a spaceship and eventually became the Romulans. That's how they explained it. I don't know if that's canon, but that's one way of explaining it. So the Remans, as you pointed out earlier, don't look a thing like Romulans.
Yeah.
So my concern is this. Do you feel that Romulans, being an empire, they were not necessarily native to that system, and they came in and they subjugated the Remans?
Yeah, that's probably because when Romulans first settled on that planet, I think the Remans, what you saw in Star Trek Nemesis, those were the people that probably were native to that world. And when, the Romulans just basically, because maybe they had greater technology than the Remans did, and they were able to, subjugate them or something like that. And then they kind of moved them off world into that other planet they were on. Right.
And who knows if the Remans were actually called Remans at first? Who knows if that wasn't just the Romulans wanted to make them into a subjugated, because it was implied they were a slave species to Romulans, basically.
Yeah.
And, I think that, but, the Remans did have this kind of, I guess, military thing of their own. I don't know. They didn't really define the Remans enough, and I would love to know what the exact problem between the Romulans and the Remans was, other than what reflected in Nemesis toward that character arc with the Picard clone and what he was trying to do. It was situational. They didn't really give much heart to what they were doing with the Remans and how that could have gone. So there was a missed opportunity with dealing with prejudice there.
Yeah.
So can you think of any other things across, TOS, TNG, DS9, and Voyager, and Enterprise that really dealt with prejudice in a major way?
Well, I don't know. Nothing really comes to mind that stands out. I think covered some of the big ones here. I mean,
because Star Trek was made in response to Prejudice.
Yeah, I mean, like I said though before, was Deep Space Nine really took on that topic quite a bit. So there's a whole bunch of episodes on Deep Space Nine where there's going to be a little bit of prejudice. Like with what was it, the Shria or whatever. Remember those people that were going to that thought Bajor was their sort of their
the spiritual home. Yes, and Quark and other characters on the show sort of felt that they were kind of an inferior, scrappy species or whatever.
They started to develop a hatred toward them, for no good reason. I mean, they just didn't like them.
Right, because they were refugees from the Dominion, right? The Dominion taken over their planet, and they.
Yeah, I think they were like refugees. They came across the wormhole into the Alpha Quadrant, and they said that they. There's something in their beliefs said that Bajor was their world, but then the Bajorans didn't want them there. So yeah, there was a kind of imprint. So Deep Space Nine really dealt with it more than the others. Now I want to get a little out of the Star Trek universe for a little bit to kind of just briefly touch, which we did last night, on Star Trek characters, and their reflection on the current times. We were talking about this last night a lot, but I'll touch on it a little bit. How in TOS especially, and this is true, characters like Uhura, Sulu, and Chekhov mostly represented the different colors of the rainbow on Earth simply by existing. They really didn't have any defining character traits that, related them to their given cultures. Except Chekhov, who only had to mention in every other episode how something was invented in Russia. I mean, they just wanted to remind you every second he was Russian. As I said, he was like that guy in Welcome Back, Carter, Epstein, who was Puerto Rican and Jewish, and his main purpose there was to remind you of that. Yeah.
He was just not a token exactly, but just remember, I'm Russian. That was just his whole thing. Where I don't think did Aurora specifically mention that she was from the United States of Africa, or was that just all understood by fandom from the script and what they intended?
I think it was in the first season that when she was speaking, what was
it? She kind of indicated that she was.
That indicated that she was probably from Africa because of the language she could speak, Swahili.
So they kind of hinted at it, but they didn't. She never. Yeah. Actually, it's funny. We also mentioned another issue in Star Trek that actually happened with Voyager, Chakotay, how they missed a great opportunity to make him into this strong Native American First Nation character. He had animal guides and he had a medicine bundle, but instead of and he had a tattoo, and they told this alien story about the connection to his tribe and him wanting to leave tribal ways to be in Starfleet. But eventually, he just became kind of a soothsayer. He just agreed with Janeway or didn't agree with her or disobeyed orders, became a gag character, or if somebody had a spiritual crisis, he broke out his medicine bundle. He just became kind of a faith healer. He didn't really, develop any strong cultural connection to his people.
Yeah.
In the end. But the best example of a Native American character integrated was on the animated series, where they had a guy named Ensign Walking Bear who identified himself as a Comanche.
Yeah.
He outright said it in a cartoon version of Star Trek, which is debatably canon, so...
Well, yeah, it depends on who you ask.
I mean, if you want to go into... I know Trek Yards has done this. If you want to go into the Bonnie Venture and the way it appeared in that series...
Yeah.
Canon... okay. Like I said, I always talk about that with you, like the Bonaventure was a Star Trek balloon or something. But anyway, we're getting way away from it now. But the point is that, yeah, so I think that in terms of real-life prejudice and dealing with native cultures, I think Star Trek is done well, but I think they need to flesh it out more in terms of well, Cisco actually overtly mentioned with that Vic Fontaine we talked about, his program got hijacked by somebody, and there were these mobsters, holographic mobsters came in, and his girlfriend Cassidy wanted to go and help this hologram, but Cisco didn't like the idea of Las Vegas in 1962 because he said it wasn't an easy time for my people. He identified himself as an African-American character and his history.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pretend it wasn't what it was, which Uhura never did. which we never saw Geordie do. And, you know, Geordie LaForge, was he from French Guiana, or they never really told you where he was from?
Well,
colony.
The thing of it is you had different people, different writers, following a certain thing, because you had Gene Roddenberry, who was, they didn't want to keep bringing up, the slavery issue.
Yeah, they really didn't do that anyway. So,
but when you got onto Deep Space Nine and you had Ira Stephen Bear and all these other people running it, and Roddenberry, of course, had passed away before that show really, started. They had their idea of how they were going to do it, and so they didn't hesitate to bring that, or to at least mention those things in the episodes.
Right. And also, you think maybe it's because they could do it? In the 60s, there were more strict regulations. Like, you couldn't talk about Vietnam. You had to call it the 20th century brush wars on the Asian continent. Where there was stricter censorship. Maybe that's all they could really do is have the characters be there.
Yeah, and it's funny because back then, they have the censors, but today it's probably even worse, because I remember watching TV shows back in the 70s that, they were throwing the N-word around right and left all on the TV shows, and everybody was laughing and in background. But today, and you get caught saying anything like that, or like what happened to Roseanne, and you're gone, and that's it, you're out of here.
Yeah, well, again,
really tightened up since then.
Again, I think that's like we mentioned with Deep Space Nine. That's that messiness where you have that situation where people who are oppressive or say oppressive things, they want permission to do so. So when they're not given that permission, when society is forced to be more respectful, they'll come up and say, "Well, now we're being victimized too. We're being discriminated against because we should have the right to be a bigot." That's what it comes down to.
How can you talk about a subject if you're not allowed to say it? You know what I'm saying? It's like if you can't bring up slavery or anything like that because it's too sensitive.
So
how are you going to be able to talk about it?
I think at this point it's going to equalize itself, basically. Yeah. But either way now, it's still not quite as taboo as it was in the 60s. I think now there's more of a conversation about it.
Yeah.
So in the 60s, there were very strict rules you couldn't do that because they didn't want to stir up conflict at all. And also they had, like with racism, they had had Nat King Cole's famous variety show canceled because of pressure from the Southern affiliates. And Star Trek, I'm sure, had the same thing. We have a lot of affiliates in the South, and we're still kind of dealing with the end of segregation and the civil rights movement. And, Star Trek is kind of coming out of that immediate post-civil rights world where, Uhura is there. Whoopi Goldberg infamously said when she first saw Uhura as a child, she said, "There's a black woman on television and she's no maid."
Yeah.
And that I'm sure Whoopi may have, said it kind of jokingly, but I can see it, that, hey, maybe I can get up there somehow too, it was liberating, just the idea of having it there. But now, I don't know. Now it's a lot messier because you've got people who are bigots who want to be able to be bigots and they feel discriminated against. And people, like you said, they respond to them by saying that, well, we know if we don't allow you to say it, you'll get mad at us. So we can't allow anybody to say it. Everybody has to be equalized.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes it hard for people. It's like you mentioned in the 70s, Norman Lear, he was a good one for using, racial epithets in a way that made them negative, that projected their negativity, and people didn't laugh with it, they laughed at it. Like like you said, how horrible this could be. But it was coming from another point of view. But now, even Norman Lear admitted recently he couldn't get away with a lot of that because a lot of bigots have ruined it. They've come out and made bigoted remarks, and people say, well, you shouldn't do that. And they'll say, well, if we're not going to be able to do it, nobody else will either.
Yeah.
Which becomes about the mentality of a 9-year-old, doesn't it? When you think about it.
Yeah.
It becomes a very juvenile thing. So, of course, when a bigot isn't allowed to say something, they're going to want to go out there. I mean, you look at any YouTube comment thread, and here we are. But
I mean, the theory is that or let's just say the ideal theory is that the more mature you are, the words won't hurt you.
Right. And
that's what Star Trek was trying to say is like
right with Uhura and the Lincoln character.
Our society has matured to the point now where these words, these catchphrases, they mean nothing to us now. They don't stir these hatreds anymore.
Right. I remember,
You know?
like I mentioned this last night, the Uhura thing with the Lincoln character. He called her a very Civil War era term, a charming
Yeah.
negress, I believe, and she
Yeah.
basically looked at him as if she barely understood what he meant. She knew the
Yeah.
word maybe, but she didn't have the meaning behind it. And he apologized and said, "Well, we used it as a description of property." And she said, "Well, why should I object to the term? Because we've learned not to fear words."
Yeah.
You know, although if you look later in D Space Nine, Keiko didn't exactly like him using the word "cardi." So,
Yeah.
but that again, I don't know. That's closer to them.
Yeah. But like I said, that was a series that had different
That was a closer
executives.
thing to them.
Yeah, they were kind of shying away from Roddenberry's Puritan vision, of a better tomorrow.
Well,
They
yeah,
didn't
but
want to bring.
like I said, so that was like later in the next generation. So they were sort of, yeah. But like I said, in terms of Earth, in terms of bigoted remarks about humans, maybe humans had learned not to fear those kind of words against themselves.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, when Cisco talked about it wasn't an easy time for my people, he wasn't really afraid. He just said, I don't want to pretend history was something that it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was more of a declaration that I am aware of my history, I'm ashamed. Picard said he was ashamed of human history. But, you know, the thing is that I think you can be ashamed and mature about it and not react hostily to words.
Yeah.
But like I said, you have to work that as a society, and you know you can't have it's like in the Star Trek universe. I mean, even Dukat, he seemed to have situations where he'd want to say, well, I like to be able to do whatever I want with the Bajorans because I have my rights too. He seemed to often look at him as being a guy who should have rights too, and the villain trying to play the victim, which, like I said, we see a lot. That's big time what's happening now. The villain trying to disguise themselves as a victim so they can do what they want to do.
Yeah.
And if society accepts a villain as a victim, and there are gray areas in society too. I agree there are gray areas, but, Goldukot and the Bajoran relationship really brought that out. So if that's the conclusion, would you say the conclusion with Star Trek and racism is that from TOS onward, that it started out in a very concrete and non-abstract way, and the issue of racism and prejudice, as it's been understood since Star Trek has gone on, became more complex as the series went on?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because they were, over the years, TV was allowed to say things they couldn't say, like you said, back in the 60s. So once that door was open, the floodgates says, that was it.
Right. Because, in TOS, it was basically Earth overcame racism. Racism is bad, the end.
Yeah.
But when you get to Deep Space Nine, it's more like, well, racism isn't a good thing, but let's explore around the whole thing now.
Yeah.
Where you could do that more. And like I said, now it's a messy in between place, but who knows? If we're talking about Star Trek Prime, I don't think it's dead. It's out there, so we'll have to see. Society is dealing with a lot of prejudice in real life now. I see the idea where it could be faced head on in Star Trek in some way. I mean, if they.
But what kind of? I mean, what future would that bode for Star Trek if we take to the next logical step where humanity continues to evolve, right? And they start leaving behind some of these, these nasty human character traits. If we take, let's say we'll take the issue of bigotry. What if they move on into the distant future with Star Trek and there is no bigotry? I wonder if that would just like make the stories bland because there's like I said, no more mirroring of humanity in it. Because
I've actually heard that a lot from even Star Trek fans, and I say to that, well, we're Star Trek fans, but we're still humans of our time.
Yeah.
And it's like that guy in Star Trek talking about not understanding how money was no longer in existence. Like, what's the challenge now? And, I mean, look, even if humans overcome the issue of bigotry in the Star Trek universe, I don't think humans will ever lose their thrill for the chase or their challenge. There'll always be something to deal with. There are issues that humans have dealt with in the past that they just simply don't do anymore. I mean, do you think humans en masse now, are hung up on things like demonic possession in a huge degree?
Yeah.
I mean, there are little pockets, but it's a little pocket. But, in millions and millions of people, which they would have probably 4 or 5 centuries ago, And it was prevalent then. Now it's considered, oh, those silly people, how could they have thought that way? even religious people. But back then, things that we have now, depression, anxiety, mental disorders, bipolarism, were all thought of as forms of demonic possession. Homosexuality, another big one. Even sometimes women wanting to work.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's unthinkable. We look at it that way now. So, you look in Star Trek's future, perhaps there'll be other challenges for human. Like, there was one in Star Trek episode in TOS where they mentioned that the humans are still repelled by physical ugliness, one of the last of our prejudices. That may never quite go away. That may not go away. They may have to face that challenge. The prejudice will come not because a person's culturally different, but I'm not comfortable looking at that ugly face,
Yeah.
I mean, those things might be a constant thing we have to deal with, but in terms of religious, racial, cultural prejudice, that probably, like you said, will ebb, and the challenge will be more superficial stuff that humanity has to face. I don't think it'll all go away. I mean, like I said, in the Star Trek universe, I never see a time where somebody's going to say, well, something, I'm going to pick, I want to get married, but I'm going to make sure I find somebody who looks like Phyllis Diller. I mean, I don't think you're going to ever find that. I mean, I think they'll still face the issue of humanity, where it's just some, where we always want to find, like Kirk, like Spock said, you're still going by the ideas of the ancient Greeks that what's good must also be beautiful. So I think humanity will still face that. So I don't think there won't be challenges. I think that we'll just evolve in our thinking. Like most humans don't look to demonic possession as the first answer to any problem anymore. We don't do bloodletting, leeching, or cupping anymore. Some of us want to, but we don't. Hello, anti-vaxxers. Anyway, I'm just saying that, but the point is that in today's world, like you were saying, I've heard that over and over again. People saying that, well, if humans are bigotry, what'll be the challenge? Well, you'll just be a little less hateful because you'll still have some things in you that are going to be hateful, to err is human, as Shakespeare had quoted. And, there'll always be challenges. It's not a cynical.
It's going to put a lot of a burden on the writers to try to creatively come up with things.
Right, yeah, because they're creating it with some of those bigotry ideas in mind.
They're really going to have to get radical in their thinking, and if they want to talk about the human condition, at some point the human condition is going to be something that we don't even know of, because it's changed so much in 500-600 years that humans are going to look something totally different than we do today. And what
you were saying basically is something that troubles me, that some people just feel that without racial hatred, what are we?
Yeah.
And to me, that gets kind of sick. So I'm hoping that in the Star Trek universe, it gets seen for what it is, and even if it's there, even if it doesn't totally go away, which we see in Star Trek, they keep plugging away at trying, which I hope they do. Because sometimes people in our culture want to go back to make things great again for bigots. I mean, again. So, I'm doing a lot of winking here, because we're living in our own time. And this conversation, that's why I wanted to bring it up, because, it's so apropos to our time where they want to turn things back because things are progressing. And in the Star Trek universe, as we said, they face that. And the difference is they realize that we don't want to do that again. We want to overcome it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. One thing in the future, they don't have to refer to the Vietnam War as the 20th century brush wars anymore. It's not that way. I mean, there's controversies, but you can refer to things like that now, where you couldn't then.
Yeah.
So the way bigotry is handled within the Star Trek universe, and the way it handles bigotry in our own world, it's a lot of contrast in the end, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, actually, we discussed this a lot. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up before I bring this to an end?
No, I think we covered a lot of it.
And not as much as last night, but we covered the good stuff. So, anyway, until next time, this has been Trek Prime. I know this conversation could bring up a lot of tension, and if you're in the YouTube comments, try to keep it clean in there. I know there's a lot of open areas for a lot of hatred, but if you listen to this and listen carefully, keep it clean. So anyway, until next
Don't be
time.
afraid to ask questions. We like that. We like
Right,
questions.
ask questions, but like I said, just keep what we're saying in mind, because this is a messy subject, but it's within the Star Trek universe. So, as D.T. Fontana might say, it's mostly happening on other planets. So,
Yep.
you know, keep the Cardassian pride stuff at a minimum. So, anyway, or whatever. So, anyway, this has been Trek Prime. Live long and prosper, everybody, and peace.